Happy Black History Month. My name is Reverend Dean Nelson, and some of you know me as the chairman of the Frederick Douglass Foundation and the Douglass Leadership Institute. And I'm always excited this time of the year to be able to talk about one of the greatest American heroes, most formidable statesmen, the abolitionist that we all know and love, Frederick Douglass. We have some fantastic things going on this week for us. It's not just Black History Month, but it's also Frederick Douglass Week. And so throughout this week, you'll be hearing from us, whether it be social media, email, or if you visit us on our website, of a number of activities that we have going on, and we're really, really excited about them. So later on this week, you'll have the opportunity to hear that we're going to push out a new website that we've developed, whoisfrederickdouglass.org. So be on the lookout, whoisfrederickdouglass.org, where you can learn a whole lot more about the life and legacy of the great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. Additionally, we'll have programming this week with our friend Bob Woodson from the Woodson Center, where they will be doing their first one-year anniversary on 1776 Unites, which highlights some tremendous stories from a very diverse group of Black Americans regarding the history and the struggle and successes of Black Americans throughout American history. And so that will happen, I believe, on Thursday evening, again, with Bob Woodson and 1776 Unite. And then later, I believe on Saturday, we'll be hosting a Black Business Forum that you do not want to miss, from some fantastic entrepreneurs and Black leaders who have worked in the business arena, from small business to working with agencies like the Small Business Administration. You'll want to hear from them. And so we have a great deal of superb programming all ready for you this week. But today, my focus really is to help people who may be unfamiliar with the why. Why Frederick Douglass? Some of you have maybe heard me speak, or some of our other Frederick Douglass Foundation leaders speak around the country. Maybe you are on our social media with the Douglass Leadership Institute. But today I wanted to be able to invite you in to learn a little bit more about why the organizations that I lead bear the name of the great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. And there's some unique things to us. And so just for the next few minutes, I want to let you know a little bit more about why Frederick Douglass has been so important to us at the Douglass Leadership Institute and the Frederick Douglass Foundation. And so here we go. Number one, it's personal. Just as a child, I was first introduced to Frederick Douglass. My mother, I remember, brought home a collection of Black history comic books. Now, these weren't DC or Marvel comic books, but these were a collection of about 20, 25 Black history comic books of famous people like Sojourner Truth, George Washington Carver, Marian Anderson, Harriet Tubman, Crispus Attucks. And as a young boy, I was really pulled into this world of Black history through these comic books. And one of the things, though, that I learned as a young boy was there was one figure who stood out. He had two comic books that were dedicated in this collection to him, and that was Frederick Douglass. So at a very early age, I was introduced to the great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. And when I learned even then as a teenager, Frederick Douglass was a teenager when he first tried to escape from slavery in the 1830s. And then ultimately on his third chance at about the age of 19, he did escape. And so as an early student, probably I was in like sixth grade, I remember getting those comic books, and that really sparked my interest as a young person. So we want to encourage you to get the word about Frederick Douglass to young people. It can spark, I hope, a new abolitionist type of movement. And so that's number one. Number two, Frederick Douglass is such an iconic hero that everybody loves. I've remarked about this a number of times to friends. Some of you will be familiar on July 4th. Almost every year now, we hear Black activists that are talking about that famous speech that he gave, I believe, in Rochester, New York, which we refer to as "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And a lot of activists love those because they were stinging words that Douglass challenged America to kind of live up to its founding principles. And while you might have activists who remember that, I'm sometimes remember hearing Republicans quote Frederick Douglass stating that I'm a black, dyed-in-the-wool Republican and would never be a part of any other party but the party of liberty and progress. So what's the point? Whether you're young, old, Republican, Democrat, Libertarians, everybody loves Frederick Douglass. And that was one of the reasons why we felt like we wanted to have an organization that was named after someone who was beloved by so many people, particularly because Douglass was known for advocating for all human rights. If you remember back, not just the abolition of slavery, but also Douglass fought for full citizenship for Black Americans. But then he was also one of the most vocal, and certainly in the early days of the women's suffrage movement, one of the first men that really got involved and provided leadership to the women's suffrage movement. And so Frederick Douglass has been an iconic person that is loved by so many people. In fact, I remember during the bicentennial in 2018, now President Joe Biden referred to Frederick Douglass as his favorite Republican. And so I think that Douglass provides that type of iconic inspiration and unity that our nation desperately needs today. And so that was probably one of the second reasons why we really selected Frederick Douglass as the namesake for our organization. I think a third reason as to why Frederick Douglass is because he was such a transformational servant leadership or leader. And when I say that, this is what I mean. Douglass was a transformational leader, and he had a cause that was bigger than himself. Many people don't know that he was also a minister of the gospel, a licensed AME Zion minister. And I think that that's really important for our organizations, the Douglass Leadership Institute and the Frederick Douglass Foundation, because we are a faith-based organization. As I talked a little bit about how I was, attracted to Frederick Douglass as a teenager, I was reminded as I learned later on in life about Frederick Douglass having a divine encounter with God. And I remember myself in probably about 12 or 13, just having a unique encounter in the presence of God. And I remember reading this also about Frederick Douglass, and it was so impactful that I think it can be easily said that it influenced his life in terms of his mission. But I think it's so important. I'm going to actually read to you part of his quote that he wrote in Life and Times, which is one of the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass. But he wrote this about his encounter. As a young man, Frederick Douglass had an encounter with God through a Methodist preacher named Hanson. And this had such a profound impact on Douglass that it would lay the foundation of faith that would guide him for the rest of his life. Here's his quote. He says, "I knew very well I was wretched. I had no means of making myself otherwise. I was for weeks a poor, broken-hearted mourner traveling through the darkness and misery of doubts and fears. And I finally found that change of heart which comes by casting one's care upon God and by having faith in Jesus Christ as Redeemer, friend, and Savior of those who diligently seek him." Man, what an encounter. And this happened to Douglass when he was a young man. He would ultimately, because he could read and write at a young age, would become a teacher of older people about the Bible. And I believe that that encounter with God would never leave him. Douglass would later become a scholar, an abolitionist who had friends from a lot of diverse viewpoints, and even people that were agnostic and atheists that were in his inner circle. But Douglass was always remained a passionate person, seeker of the truth, but also a dedicated Christian and minister of the gospel, oftentimes using the biblical imagery in many of his messages, which I'm proud to say that in the book from David Blight, I believe, Prophet of Freedom. Blight describes Douglass as this prophet and uses a lot of that biblical imagery. So even scholars do recognize how such a profound impact that Douglass's encounter with God and Christianity had on him. Kind of in the same vein brings us to like the other reason, number 4, about why Frederick Douglass for us, and that is the values. Douglass preached and taught and wrote often about this idea of righteousness and justice. If you're a minister or if you're a Christian or a person of faith, you'll recognize that often the words righteousness and justice find themselves in Scripture together. And we've highlighted that. In fact, one of Douglass's favorite quotes of mine, he says, "I have one great political idea. The best expression of it I have found in the Bible. It is in substance, righteousness exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people." He says, that's the whole of my politics, the positive and the negative of my politics. In our culture today, sometimes we are almost forced to like pick sides, that somehow you either have to be committed to morality or justice. But I believe that Douglass amplified or exemplified the idea that we could have both and that we could advocate for justice issues or causes, but also as a society that largely believes in God and has a understanding that there is right and that there is wrong. I believe that Douglass exemplified both that kind of cross between those two ideals. And that's something that we try really hard to do at the Douglass Leadership Institute and at the Frederick Douglass Foundation, where we are both highlighting righteousness and justice. One of the things that we stand for, or one of our platforms, is strengthening the Black family. We feel like that the family is a God-ordained institution, and what we can do to undergird it and to support it is extremely important. We also push for meaningful criminal justice reform, economic and educational opportunity. These are things that are not easily fit into kind of the right or left column always, but really ordinary people really wanting to affirm kind of biblical principles of morality, but also at the same time understanding justice and tolerance. And that's something that we try to emulate at the Douglass Leadership Institute and Frederick Douglass Foundation. And that is another reason why we selected Frederick Douglass as kind of the iconic, hero, because those are biblical values. Those are honestly American values, and we try hard to push those things through the work that we do all around the country. Now, the last reason of why Frederick Douglass, this one is probably something that has not been told that often, but it is a very unique story that you would want to hear. And it started actually back in 2009 when Dr. Timothy Johnson, who was the founder, along with myself and Troy Rowling of the Frederick Douglass Foundation, Tim and I decided to have a meeting in Washington, D.C. in 2009. This was after President Obama had been elected. And this meeting was largely with independents, conservatives, and Republicans, about 15 of us that gathered in Washington, D.C. Right about the time that President Obama was going to be sworn in and to take office. And we knew that we celebrated the fact that America had come to a place where it could elect somebody like President Obama. But at the same time, we knew that some of the things that he was advocating for were not consistent with those within the African American community. And so we began to think about, how do we, in an appropriate way, affirm the things, the principles and the values that many of us as conservatives were holding, but at the same time do it at a time period where America was celebrating its first Black president. And so we had this gathering here in Washington, D.C. And that night, Tim spent the night at my home, and he had a dream that night. The next morning, he got up and he was telling me about this dream, and he asked me if I knew anything about Frederick Douglass. And I told him what I did know, but then I went behind or downstairs in my basement, and I pulled out this big poster that I had, and it said Douglass Leadership Lecture Series. And it was a lecture series that I had started with having ministers, African American ministers, talk about the intersection of faith and public policy. And as I pulled that out, Tim was just struck by the fact that I had this huge poster of Frederick Douglass. And we began to talk a little bit more that day. And about a month later, he gives me a call and he says, "Congratulations." I said, "Congratulations, what for?" He says, "You're the vice chairman of the Frederick Douglass Foundation." And that's how the Frederick Douglass Foundation got started in 2009. And shortly thereafter, we would host events in Washington, D.C., and would do some great work, which some of you are familiar with. But that's the other reason of why Frederick Douglass, because of a divine dream that we believe that God gave Tim Johnson about the life of this great abolitionist. Even though Tim didn't know a whole lot about Frederick Douglass at the time, we would later have a lot of discussion, and we would learn a whole lot more. As much I'm learning more every year about Frederick Douglass, from being connected a little bit to one of his direct descendants of Ken Morris, through the scholarship of others. And I'll refer a few books probably as I get ready to close. But I want to encourage you, learn more about the great abolitionist. Visit our website at whoisfrederickdouglass.org. Also take the time to read some of the books like David Blythe, his book, or Frederick Douglass, who you may know had 3 autobiographies. The first that he wrote was a narrative, which was designed to help people to know about how horrible slavery was. So it was like the first, true story narrative that was written for, the masses, about the first hand account of a man who had been a slave. The second one, My Bondage and My Freedom, which Frederick Douglass wrote, and that was his bestseller because he had now lived in freedom just as long as he had been in slavery. And he talks about that. And then lastly, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. So those are 3. If you're a woman, you might be interested in a great book that I started a couple of years ago, that was referred to Women in the World of Douglass, is something that also I would highly recommend. But listen, just to capsulize what we shared today, number one, why Douglass? One, because it was a personal encounter with me that I had when my mother gave me those comic books early on when I was a young boy that gave me a thirst for knowledge and a desire to know more about the great abolitionist. Then, because Frederick Douglass is loved by all of those folks, that's another reason why we appreciate him so much. He's an American icon that is a bridge builder. It brings so many different people together because of who he was and what he represents. Then for us, because he was a minister, servant leader who had a divine encounter with Christ, and he talks personally about that. That's the third. Number 4, the values that he stood for: righteousness and justice. Douglass couldn't easily be put in the box of right or left, and that's another reason why we treasure him and what he has done. And then lastly, the great divine dream that Dr. Timothy Johnson had at my house back in 2009. So listen, thank you so much for sharing your time with me. I hope that you've learned a little bit more about why Frederick Douglass, and I pray that you will continue to learn more about Frederick Douglass and about the organizations that we're a part of, the Frederick Douglass Foundation, which is a little bit more of a political entity, if you're into that, or the Douglass Leadership Institute, which is simply a nonpartisan 501c3 that seeks to help engage and train leaders to apply the principles that Frederick Douglass lived by to our current life and our current culture. Thank you so very much. Please don't forget to join us a little bit later on this week for some of the other fantastic programs that we have going on. It's been a pleasure to be with you. God bless you.